Hey, welcome. Here we are at another Think In. It's this Friday, being Friday lunchtime. It's Sensemaker Live with Santander. I'm David Taylor, one of the editors at Tortoise. And today, at the end of another tumultuous week in America, we're asking the question, can Trump still win in November? It's clearly been a week on the ground where you just feel like you can't take your eyes off it. So it might seem strange to look above the horizon, but I think it's probably right that really the responses you're seeing politically are all with at least one eye on November the 3rd. And I'm delighted to say that we've got two fantastic guests from DC joining us today, both great readers of American politics and elections. We've got Sabrina Siddiqui, who is national political reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and she's an analyst with CNN. We've worked together in the States in recent years, and on the 2016 case where she was on the election trail. She's one of those great road warriors who's away from home for months and comes back with a travel bag full of receipts from Starbucks and not much else. And we've got Charlie Cook, who's editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report. And if you've ever been posted to Washington, you'll know, if you want to learn fast, that Charlie's briefings are unmissable. I can fondly remember some breakfast time sessions myself where you'd go along and at about 9 o'clock in the morning you'd come out feeling twice as smart and knowing exactly where you were going to go next time. So what I'm hoping is both of these guys are going to tell us what we need to be thinking about and where this battle is going to be fought in November and over what issues. But before we get to that, just a quick bit of housekeeping. If you haven't been to a Think In before, I should just let you know that it's not like a traditional panel discussion. We want to hear from everybody. It's like an open news meeting. And if you want to join in the conversation on video, you can use the chat function in Zoom to just let us know that you want us to come to you. And you're probably all Zoom veterans by now, but just to run you through a couple of things where you'll have been automatically muted when you joined the call. But my colleague Harika is going to be moderating the chat. And if you want to make a point in the text there, you're obviously free to do that. And then, if you want to get involved in the video discussion, it's pretty straightforward to do that. And if you know this setup by now, there's a little button at the bottom that says participants. And if you click on that, you can see who's with us. And you get a chance there to click on a little button that says raise hand. And that's going to indicate to us that you're really up for joining the discussion. And if you want, we can have a little practice with that, with a question right now. So why don't you, if you found that button, why don't you raise your hand wherever you are if you're anxious about the election in November? And I can see a lot of blue hands have gone up there. And keep them up if you know who will win. And again, the uncertainty that I hoped for, that I'm pretty excited about drilling down into with you two guys. It's there for all to see. So the good news is, if you don't know who's going to win in November, you're in good company, because no one really does. I was reminding myself that somebody once said to me in DC, remember, we're all just plus or minus 3 points away from being an idiot. And I think in that spirit, that's where we start. So we should treat this maybe as a hunt for clues rather than the search for a definitive answer. So Sabrina, can I start with you? How are you doing?
Well, I am doing all right. I think what's been remarkable already, if I think back to covering the 2016 election and just how much of it was unpredictable, and when you really didn't know where the story was going to take you, we are in a similar moment now. For the last several months, the entire election had essentially been overtaken by the pandemic that is coronavirus, of course. And so in many ways, we were looking at this as the pandemic election. And what is that going to mean politically? What is the country going to look like in November? And within just the last few weeks, we have now, of course, shifted into this national discussion around police brutality and racial justice. And so that has really brought to the fore this conversation about racism in America and whether or not we are at an inflection point as a country, manifested, of course, through the protests all across the country and in some ways around the world. So, you know, the conversation has once again changed very quickly. So I'm trying to keep track of all of it.
And all from your apartment rather than from your usual sort of métier, which is scurrying around on the hill and all of that good stuff.
Exactly, all from the comfort of my living room. So where that's another aspect of this that's changed the way in which we are all reporting. We're not on the ground in most cases. And so we don't know when we'll be back on the ground. The president's eager to restart his rallies. I cover former Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic presumptive presidential nominee. So I don't know when he's going to restart his own rallies. He's been more cautious than Trump. So it's a lot of wait and see, and again, as unpredictable as ever.
And as you say, although right now we're really feeling the heat of protest and the movement for change there, but you know, if the US is having to deal with a second spike of COVID-19, this rapidly could become the pandemic election again. It's going to be a long 4 months, isn't it?
Absolutely. We don't know yet if there's going to be a second wave. And as the country cautiously reopens and returns to business as usual, whatever that looks like, I'm not sure anyone really knows what the new normal is. It could very well kick off that second wave, another surge in cases. And as a country, the US already has more cases than any other country in the world. So to your point, we could be, once again, talking about the pandemic election going into November. We could be talking about something that we haven't even touched upon yet because we don't know what's around the corner.
Let's face it, both of these guys are in their 70s. So, their own health could figure quite large in the months to come. Can I just ask you, before I go to Charlie, can I just ask you just to give us 30 seconds on each of the candidates and how they're behaving right now, just to sort of set the scene? Let's start. Let's start with Trump.
Well, I think that Trump right now is, a bystander in what is a national conversation around race. He, as is always the case, has personalized everything. And so the protests are a reflection of his presidency. He cannot take himself out of the conversation. And even as his own supporters are showing some sense of support for the movement on the streets, maybe not as much as the rest of the country, but you've seen even a little bit of a shift in the nation's thinking about police violence, about Confederate statues and honoring, those figures in U.S. history. Trump is continuing to dig in his heels as usual. He wants to restart rallies despite the counsel of public health experts. Very much exactly what you think. There's Trump on an island and there's everyone else.
And how about Biden? Biden's in the basement, right?
Yeah, he's been out a bit more. He's started traveling once again, cautiously. And I think Biden sort of has seen this moment as, running the shadow government, sort of being the president that many people expect to see in these moments, meeting with the family of George Floyd, kind of acting as a grief counselor as he often has in his own career, because he's been touched by grief with the loss of his son, with the loss of his wife and infant daughter decades ago. You've seen him hold roundtables with public health experts, really heed their counsel when he thinks about how he should, return to the public eye, what kind of events he should hold, putting out all these proposals on how the government should handle the pandemic. So I think he's sort of trying to act like the commander in chief, even if he's not yet in that role. He would like to be. And of course, that's going to be up to voters in November.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Okay, well, that's great. Just as a little scene setter, Charlie, if you would, if we can come to you, and I should just share with the rest of the group that Charlie was just telling me before we came on the call that there's a new phenomenon in town in DC, a service called Rate My Room, which is giving people marks out of 10 for their backdrop, and Charlie got a 9, and he slipped to an 8. But he's hoping he's back up to a 9 because he's just moved that that little thermostat out of shot, haven't you?
Yes, and also I'm cheating a little bit. One of our sons is a producer for ABC News based in Denver, and so he was giving me some virtual advice on the shot and the lighting and what kind of microphone to buy and all kinds of things like that. So I had some professional help.
It's fantastic. Well, it's just putting me in mind of a still from a Wes Anderson movie. You're perfectly symmetrical. It's quite magnificent. This is where I'd like to start, Charlie, if it's okay with you, and it's just to remind people what happened in 2016 and how very close it was between Trump and Clinton.
First, just a disclaimer. You know, when I saw the topic, "Can Trump still win?" I kind of pulled back a little bit, but you qualified it because we've got to be reminding ourselves. Look, we're talking about human behavior. We're talking about a very not evenly divided country, but a very narrowly divided country and very bitterly divided country, so that there is going to be some uncertainty no matter what. Then you've got the most unconventional national political figure that we've had in our lifetimes. And then you have sort of this, okay, are there foreign actors? Are there entities that are going to try to stir things up? And then the effect of the coronavirus on the actual election process. Yep. And that some of the election officials that we have now are behaving in a far more partisan way than they were, say 10, 20, 30 years ago. So you kind of push all that in, you have an enormous amount of uncertainty. But I do think, I think you're starting off at the right place, because I think to look at 2020, you ought to have sort of some understanding or some theory of what happened in 2016. And, I think it was something of, the overused metaphor, the perfect storm. It was a very, very odd election. I mean, we had close elections before, but from 1888 all the way until 2000, that every time you had a close election, or every time the popular vote, electoral college vote, went the same way, and we kind of got a little spoiled. And then when 2000 occurred, and granted, Gore only won the popular vote by 0.5 percentage point, and we knew it was going to be a really close race, and Florida was obviously weird and stuff, but we treated that like it was a fluke. And then when 2016 occurred, and going in, Hillary Clinton had a 3-point lead in the national polls, and there were certain states that most people sort of thought were going to be the battleground states. And then election night comes, and suddenly her popular vote margin isn't the 3 points that the polls thought it would be. Instead, it was 2.1 percentage points, which is usually still enough to get, where it would translate into the electoral college. But then you had her losing Michigan and Pennsylvania, 2 states that had gone Democratic 6 times in a row. Michael Dukakis in 1988 was the last Democrat to lose either one of those. And then Wisconsin, that had gone Democratic 7 times in a row. Walter Mondale in 84 was the last Democrat to lose those. And the thing is, she didn't even compete in 2 out of those 3. And in Pennsylvania, while they certainly did contest the Pittsburgh in the East or Philadelphia in the East and Pittsburgh in the West, but they didn't think they needed to do anything in the middle. Yeah. They just ran up the score in Philadelphia. So the thing is, on election night, I don't know who was more surprised, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. I mean, I know we all were very, very, very surprised. Yeah. So, but it was a weird outcome. And that the fact that you had the 2 most unpopular nominees that each party had ever nominated made it really unusual. And then the last thing was that you had, 18% of the voters, 60% had an unfavorable view of Trump, 54% had an unfavorable view of Hillary Clinton. It was 17 or 18% had an unfavorable view of both of them. And you think, okay, what are they going to do? Are they going to not vote? Are they going to split down the middle? Do they vote for write in somebody else? But they went for Trump by whatever one number is 17, the other is 18-point margin. And it's like, wow, what was that all about? So it was the flukiest election that we've ever seen. And I was really relieved in 2018 when it was sort of a return to normalcy that,
let's get to the midterms in a little while. But, and again, just to finish all of those, just reminding ourselves of that seismic moment. I forget the numbers, but I think it was something like 37 million votes cast, and in the end, it was a tiny few thousand, wasn't it, across those three states?
It was 137 million nationwide, and it came down to a little bit less than 78,000 votes in 3 states. So Michigan was 0.2 of 1 percentage point, and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin were 0.7 of 1 percentage point. So, I mean, wow.
Wow, indeed. So shall we just to set the scene a little for this conversation, then just think about where you think the key states are going to be this time. And I think it seems like there are more than just those 3 in play.
I think there's 6 actually that are in play. But I think though, just to frame it up slightly, this is an election where everything has changed and nothing has changed. And you have, greatest public health emergency in 102 years, one of the biggest crises our country's faced since Pearl Harbor, economy going off a cliff, the worst in 90 years, and suddenly civil unrest that we haven't seen since 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed. So all of these things have happened, but the structure of the race is exactly where it was 6 months ago. It's where it was a year ago. The structure and where the race is hasn't moved. And if I gave you a chart with President Trump's Gallup or any of his job approval ratings, and if I challenged you, show me on that graph where the economy went off a cliff. Show me where on that graph you had, the biggest crisis that we've had, maybe along with 9/11, or actually bigger than 9/11. You couldn't find it. And if you charted out Biden, Trump, and if you looked at that, you couldn't tell when any of that happened. And so it's completely changed the nature of the campaign. Yeah. It's changed how the election is going to be conducted and all that. But the structure of the race isn't much different than it was then. Because
by that you mean that approval ratings up or down, they're pretty much staying where they were, and also the places where it will be fought.
Right. Well, the thing is that President Trump has the narrowest trading range of any president we've ever had. I mean, he's got a very high floor and a very low ceiling. Right. He is the first president we've ever had, in the history of polling anyway, to never hit a 50% approval level. There are other presidents that have gone lower than his low, but their averages were all way, way higher than his, and their heights were, places that he could only dream about. But the thing is that the trial heat figures really, they've changed a little in the last 2 weeks. In the wake of the George Floyd or fall out a little bit from there, but all these other events had virtually no effect on his numbers, and that his numbers have been almost impervious to any kind of developments out there. But to get to your original question is, I think we're looking at, first of all, the same 3 as last time: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then we've got 3 more that we're going to focus on as well. First of all, Florida. Florida's Florida. And, Obama in 2012 carried it by 1 point. Trump carried it by 1 point. The Senate and governor's races in 2018 were settled by 1 point. I mean, Florida's just going to be really, really, really close. But the other 2 are Arizona and North Carolina. And these are states, and it kind of reflects some of the demographic changes that are going on, that Democrats we're having some softness in some states, those Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Frost Belt states, where there are an unusually large number of working class whites and working class whites who live in manufacturing areas, which is sort of prime Trump country. But at the same time, we've got fast growing suburbs.
Yeah.
And relatively affluent college educated suburbs, and college educated suburban women tend to loathe President Trump, so that you're seeing this change in voting patterns. So that Arizona, which was a red not that long ago, is now in the purple range. North Carolina, Virginia has already gone blue. It was red. North Carolina is in this purple right there, and just a little bit behind North Carolina in terms of transitioning from red towards blue. You've got Georgia just a little bit behind that. You've got Texas, a bit further back. But we're seeing all these shifts back and forth. But those six, I think, it's where the election is going to be focused on. And right this moment, at least if you go by the Real Clear Politics average, Joe Biden has a lead of a little over 3 percentage points in 5 out of 6, and North Carolina is basically tied. I think Trump has a half a point lead or something like that. But those leads, that's what's happened in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, kind of the fallout, not of coronavirus directly, not of the economy, not handling of those things directly. But I think the George Floyd thing, that seems, and his behavior around it has changed things. But we can talk later about how that happened, because I'm talking too much here.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great start. And I'm just going to come back to you, Sabrina, to think about the last couple of weeks and the impact of George Floyd. What do you think it's done to the national conversation? And I know you've been doing some reporting yourself on again one of the more harrowing recent cases. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that too.
Sure. I'll start with the latter part, only because I think that what you saw in the month of May was a number of cases that brought us to this point. And I've been covering that of Ahmaud Arbery, an unarmed Black man who was jogging in a residential neighborhood in Southeast Georgia when he was pursued by 3 white men. And then ultimately he was gunned down in broad daylight. There is an ongoing case with respect to that, but those 3 men have been charged with murder. And it kind of kicked off this conversation about race and the idea that a Black man lost his life simply in the course of doing a routine activity like jogging. And then you had Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, who was killed by police in a shooting while she was in her own home. They said it was a botched drug raid. And then there were some serious questions raised about the tactics that the police used to forcibly enter her home in the middle of the night. And finally, after that, you had George Floyd. So I think that in some ways there was, at least on the ground, a brimming frustration that we were here once again, 6 years after Ferguson, after the death of Michael Brown, and other unarmed Black men 6 years ago, that had kicked off similar protests around police brutality. But with George Floyd and the video that was seen around the world and the events that had preceded that, like I said, with Ahmaud Arbery, with Breonna Taylor, kind of this conversation about race kind of brimming to the surface once again, we reached a tipping point where a lot of Americans, I think, took a step back, and for the first time, I think really reached this point of reckoning where they at least wanted to better understand the pain that Black Americans have experienced really since the inception of this country. And I think what has been different about these protests is that there has been a very cross-sectional representation of America out there marching on the streets. 6 years ago, when you had protests around police violence and racial justice, you still had mostly younger and mostly Black Americans marching on the streets. There has been a great deal of diversity when you look at the demonstrations across the country over the last 3 weeks. And that is what I think does separate it in many ways. It has also been much more sustained, and it has been much more widespread. These are not just protests happening at the scene of the crime. These are protests that are happening in major cities all across the country, large and small. You've even seen it, as we were saying earlier on in this discussion, in countries overseas. And so I think that public opinion has already been shifting over the last few years around criminal justice. You've seen an increase in support for criminal justice reform. But now you are seeing, I think, a stronger wave of support for addressing some of the systemic issues that are really at the root of that system. And that means really taking on directly America's legacy with respect to racism.
I think so. I mean, someone's making a point in the chat as well that there's something singular about this moment that we're all in. We've all been in lockdown and had our lives disrupted, and I suppose for again millions of people around the world, uncertainty, inequality, and really the sort of the search for dignity is all in play, isn't it? And it seems like what happened the last moments of George Floyd have spoken to people on lots of levels where they're questioning the way fundamentally things are done.
You know, I don't disagree with anything Sabrina said, not a word. But I don't think this election is going to turn on this at all. Mm-hmm. Because this election, first of all, I don't think Americans tend to vote on issues. There's partisanship, there are perceptions of candidates, there are all kinds of things, but like there's some real national debate over issues, that rarely happens. And this election, it is going to be, it's not a choice between two candidates. It's going to be a referendum up or down on President Trump. Mm-hmm. Do you want to extend his contract for another 4 years? Yes or no? And that's what's shaping this election. And job approval, all these things had been very vulnerable. But I think what he was behind, but not by a whole lot. What I think has changed in the last, and I'd say even 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that's changed is that you've got a Republican Trump base over here that's, let's just call it 40%. And those people are never, ever going to abandon Donald Trump. When he said that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his supporters would not abandon him, those are probably the truest words the man has ever said. Mm-hmm. Then you've got a base over here of between 45, 48% mm-hmm. that are the exact, they hate him. So there's the lovers, there's the loathers, but in the middle, you have a group of people that don't love him, they don't loathe him. Mm-hmm. A lot of them don't pay a whole lot of attention to politics, but they were pulled. They thought the economy was going great and they were giving him credit. But at the same time, they had these doubts about him as a person, his character, his behavior, his leadership style, the way he governs. Now, but they were kept in balance. And as long as the economy was good, this was okay. But how long of a shelf life does a great economy have when it's no longer great? How long does it last? And you take that away, and I think the doubts about him go up. And I think the George Floyd thing plays into, just sort of behavior that, wait a minute, this isn't what presidents are supposed to do. This isn't, and some of this reflect off the coronavirus task force hearings and all this, but I wonder whether we've just hit a tipping point in the last couple of weeks of where the Trump fatigue among these people right here is starting to really set in, just in the same way that.
And it's partly about character and it's partly about competence, I suppose that. that being said, I think again I'm conscious that that in the chat. At least one person sort of saying it always feels like there's a presumption that there's an anti-Trump, he's intolerable sort of thread going through this type of conversation. And I wouldn't mind just kind of tackling that head on. You know, I mean, as I think both of you have said, he was, you know, he's at the least the most unusual president that anyone can think of. But I wonder what is the case that he could sort of fight an election on. I think, Sabrina, I'm just going to throw that to you first of all. That what do you think that you know, what do you think it looked like at the beginning of the year? Democrats a little bit being pulled in two different directions, economy flying. What was the sort of the confident step towards November that the Trump campaign was anticipating?
Well, I think a great deal of it had to do with the economy. I agree that was really at the center of the campaign's case, that, you know, Trump is who he is, take it or leave it, but the economy is booming, and they tried to at least point to what they saw as his own role in that economic progress. And I think that they also, of course, played into some of the same grievance politics that have always been a core part of his identity. You know, kind of because he's had such a poor, to put it mildly, relationship with Democrats on Capitol Hill, focusing in on the investigations, impeachment, to try and shore up support within his base, really hoping they can mobilize people around what, at least, you know, he and his campaign and the White House have always framed as politically motivated witch hunts. And so it's not that he has changed in any meaningful way. It's just trying to convince enough Americans that he has been able to still govern, and if they feel with a certain degree of success, and if they feel like economically they are better off than they were 4 years ago, then they should give him another chance. Yes. But I do think that has reached a tipping point where, you know, those people who are in the middle, because again, you know, I agree with Charlie, you have the support, that's the supporters who are never going to leave him. It's about those suburban voters, the people who kind of held their nose and voted for him, or people who sat out the last election or voted third party. You know, are they now at the point where it's no longer enough to just say that, okay, the economy is in fine shape, so why not just give him a second term? I think it has reached the point where they look at, first of all, the pandemic and his handling of the pandemic. You know, that led to a great deal of uncertainty across the country, and, you know, its own form of unrest. And now in the last 3 weeks, you have a much more visceral form of unrest in the streets, which has been inflamed in many ways by the president's own response to the protests. Is it now at the point where enough of those Americans in the middle feel like this country is spiraling out of control?
Right. Yes.
And they want to return to
going in the right direction or not.
Right. Then they want to return to normal, which has been at the center of Joe Biden's message, even to the frustration of progressive voters in the Democratic Party. If you think back to the primaries, they wanted to see progressive proposals on healthcare, on education. They were in a much more ideological debate about policy. And I think to Charlie's point, Joe Biden, his campaign sort of recognized that elections are actually rarely about policy. And it's really going to be a referendum on Trump, and whether or not it will, enough Americans say we want more stability. Right. And that is really going to be what's at the center of Joe Biden's campaign: competence, and the government once again functioning in the way that many Americans believe it should.
Well, I think go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I suppose, what if you were asking what's in the credit sheet for for conservative voters, they clearly would point to the Supreme Court and the significance of the change that has been able to be instituted there, the balance of the court for much longer than Trump's tenure is going to be skewing conservative, and a lot of judges at lower levels too. And so I think it's been a strand of argument, hasn't it, that evangelicals who might not be very impressed by the character of the man nevertheless see his value in enabling them to prevail in what they think of as the most significant cultural issues.
I'd been around politics for close to 50 years. And the way I learned it was that politics is about addition. And particularly when you have a president that comes in who lost the popular vote and that won, I mean, legitimately won, but it was a photo finish under very unusual circumstances. But if you come in and you've won fewer votes than the other person, but it's not how many votes you get, but where do you get them? Usually you're trying to expand. You're trying to expand your support. And President Trump, that's just not in his DNA. And everything has been doubling down on core groups, making sure they hang in there. But it was all predicated, as Sabrina said, on a strong economy. And you take the strong economy out, and all he's left is with his base. That strong economy was the key for getting those in-betweeners that don't love him and don't loathe him. That was the key. So that's why their campaign has kind of come unmoored, because it was all centered around the economy. Now you ask, well, why do Republicans hang in there with him if they don't, some of them don't like his style and all that, but he does have 85, 90% job approval rating. But I think there are four things that keep Republicans on board. Number one, the economy was keeping them together. It was like, this is great. This is great. Number two, the tax cuts. That was great for him. Number three, less regulation. Now, this is the least sexy, but they have basically done 180 on regulation since the Obama administration. For a lot of conservatives, Republicans, that's a big deal. And then, as you said, David, it's the judges. So those are the four things that keep Republicans who may have problems with his style, with his personality, with his tweeting. That's what's kept him on board. But again, we're losing, one of those elements with the economy.
Let's just have a little bit of a deeper dive, Charlie, into those key states as you see them. I know that we could easily get into the I-4 corridor in Florida or the collar counties of Philadelphia, and I'm not afraid to go there. I think I'd really love to have you tell us within those crucial states in Pennsylvania, where does he have to hold the ground, Trump, and where does Biden need to succeed if he's going to make him a one-term president?
Well, and this also addresses the point that you said had come up in the chat, is that if God told me today that President Trump was going to get reelected, and I had to offer right now an explanation for how it happened, my guess would be he managed to win precisely the same 30 states he did last time. Yeah. Biden will win the same 20 states that Hillary Clinton did, but that Trump was able to prevail in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania by finding more people that are just like the people that did and have support as him, but who are not registered or not regular voters, and move that up. Because if you look at the entire United States, you've got basically, in terms of non-college whites, you have a certain number. And then if you add all minority voters, and then you add college-educated whites, that they're dead even, okay? But in those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, there's a disproportionately larger number of non-college whites. And these are people that, hey, the change in the economy over the last 20, 30, 40 years has not been good to them. And that anger, fear, frustration, anxiety. So that's the key. Now, working class white guys, working class white men, they are 1,000,000% on board with Trump. And college educated white women, and minority voters are very, very, very strongly anti. But in terms of demographically, the two groups that are getting fought over on a persuasive side, two big groups, one would be non-college educated women, white women. That would be women with less than a 4-year college degree. So they're working class, which pulls them more towards Trump, but they're women that kind of pulls it back. And then college educated white men who the gender identity stuff kind of pulls towards Trump, but we're seeing in increasingly recent years a skew towards more education, more going Democratic, which is opposite of where it used to be. And geographically, the Trump base, it's built around small town, rural America, and farther out suburbs. So that, take Pennsylvania, for example, and you wanted to get into geography. Hillary Clinton came out of Philadelphia with a 450,000 vote margin, the city of Philadelphia. Yeah. Add in the collar suburban counties, they got the votes they thought they needed to win. Throw in out west, Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, they got the vote. But what you saw was an extraordinary A, level of support, and B, turnout in the middle and across the top, that you had counties where Trump got over 80% of the vote. A few over 80 and a whole bunch over 70. And they weren't big counties, but, Democrats can't forfeit, out beyond the metropolitan areas. And they have, and Democrats have forfeited sort of working class whites. Yes. And that's where he's run up the score. And that's where they're mining for votes in these to try to preserve it in those 30 states that he won.
Yeah, I think so. I was last in the US in February this year, and we went to one of those counties. We went to Northampton County in Pennsylvania, and the reason we went there was that it was precisely that. I think out of about, correct me if I'm wrong, there's about 3,100 counties in the US, and I think I'm right in saying 209 of them had voted twice for Obama and then flipped to Trump. And it feels like they are the ones where it was won last time and is going to be fought over again.
A lot of people have different ways of looking at it, and I am not that much into it was Obama voters that flipped over and voted for Trump. I mean, I'm sure it happened, some, but to me that doesn't explain what happened. I mean, to me, what happened was, you had a block of people that were never, ever, ever going to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, that just wasn't going to happen. But boy, they weren't happy about voting for Hillary Clinton, that she had 25 years of accumulated baggage. Mm-hmm. And that while her husband, at least until Me Too, seemed to have a Teflon coating that stuff just didn't stick, she was Velcro. Everything stuck to her. And so she had so much baggage, but you had a decent number of voters and a fair number of women who were going to vote for her, but they didn't really want to. They weren't enthusiastic. Some of them were going to hold their noses and vote for her. But that last month before the election seemed over, particularly after the Billy Bush Access Hollywood tape. Mm-hmm. It was over. There was no way she could lose. There was no way Donald Trump could win. Mm-hmm. And so anybody that really didn't want to vote for her didn't have to, because she was going to win. And they just flat didn't show up. Meanwhile, on the other side, the people that were for Trump, most of them didn't think he was going to win, but by God, they wanted to make a statement. They had an intensity, and the other side had an ambivalence. And you had a lot of surprise people on election night who didn't bother to vote because they didn't think it was even contested so much anymore.
So that's interesting. Let's come back to that in a little bit. I'm gonna just go, if I can, to Dan Laws, who's got his hand up and I think wanted to make a point. Dan, how
Hi,
you
good
doing?
afternoon. Can you hear
Where are
me
you
okay?
joining us from?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting session. I've been following the two campaigns very closely. And as an international relations and history student, I've been really interested in the anti-Chinese populist rhetoric that's coming out of the Trump camp. It seems to be a really core part of his message on social media in particular. I was just wondering what the panelists thought of that. First of all, how popular is it? Is it playing well, especially in the key swing states? Will it continue to be a huge part of the campaign? And also, what's the impact on international relations if that does appear to be a huge part of his campaign?
Yeah. Sabrina, do you want to grab that one first of all, Sabrina?
Sure. You know, I think that without question, the reason that China has been injected into the conversation stems from coronavirus, and I think an attempt by both candidates to lay the blame at the hands of the Chinese government with respect to transparency around the early stages of the virus and its spread. But they have done so in different ways. I think Trump characteristically has leaned into that instinct he has to kind of stoke fear more broadly around, you know, the Chinese population. You know, you heard him repeatedly insist on, you know, on even referring to the virus as a Chinese virus, whereas Joe Biden has talked a little bit more about, you know, even if in broad strokes, holding China accountable, even if he hasn't necessarily said how he would do that. I think that, you know, for Trump, that kind of rhetoric that you heard from him being tough on China, that plays again to his base. And I think also he was trying to appeal to some of those voters in those key states we've talked about, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those working class voters who believe that because of US trade policy, China has gained an unfair edge over the United States. I don't think that necessarily is, having said that as an issue, moves a lot of people. I also think that, you know, if you look even at the way in which the news cycle has shifted quite dramatically, foreign policy just has not really stuck as an issue. Right. You know, there was a moment where it was about Trump abruptly withdrawing troops from Syria, and that was a crisis in the fall. Then he had that brinkmanship with Iran, and that seemed like a crisis. Are we going to go to war with Iran or not? That was all anyone could talk about in the campaign for a week or two. Now, for a period of time in their early stages of the coronavirus, it had to do with U.S.-China relations. But it just hasn't stuck in a meaningful way, and I'm not sure if Charlie disagrees or agrees.
Internationally, I think there was... You can still draw on and recall the sense of amazement when George W. Bush won a second term, because everybody else in the world thought, well, surely America will turn their backs on him because of Iraq, and couldn't understand it. But I think it plays to what you said, that really these big foreign policy questions are not the ones that ultimately decide the election at home.
You know, I think people in Europe have a hard time understanding this, but Americans do not vote on foreign policy issues. They don't. Never have. And even when it seems like they did, it's actually just sort of a topic like the Iranian hostage crisis. Well, that was really about Jimmy Carter. Is he decisive? Is he strong? Is he effective? And so it really wasn't even a foreign policy issue there. But you go back 50 years ago, and if you said, ask Americans, who is the economic threat to the US? They would all say Japan. And now it's kind of come up, and a lot of people have lost jobs. Some of it has been trade. You know, you used to be able to have, if you were a non-college educated person, you could be a member of the middle class with a good job in manufacturing and all that. A lot of those jobs have gone away. Some of it was trade, some of it was automation, but it's become personified with China. Now, China's unfavorable ratings, if you measure them in polls, has been going up for quite a few years, and we're reaching pretty high levels. Now, in terms of President Trump and Joe Biden, each one of them, China isn't an issue. There's not a pro-China, anti-China candidate here, really. What you've got is China is a cudgel.
Mm.
It's a club that each one is trying to beat the other one with, but part of it is offensive and part of it's defensive. And that the defensive part is each one has some exposure on this. For Joe Biden, you know, on top of just all the nice things and wonderful things and toasts at banquets and things that are on video, but it's his son Hunter's, some of his business dealings there that I don't think were terribly nefarious, but clearly that's, you know, the Trump campaign is going to use that against him. And then Trump had, you know, President Xi, I want to, you know, thank you. You guys have done such a great job on handling the coronavirus. He's got some vulnerability over there. So each one's trying to inoculate themselves on this issue and try to draw blood from the other guy. So to me, it's not an issue. It's more of a weapon that each side are trying to do, and each side's trying to inoculate themselves from someplace where they are somewhat vulnerable.
I'm just going to ask, throw this open. There's a couple of other factors that we haven't touched upon. One is turnout, and I think some people in the chat are asking the question whether or not the outpouring of agonies over George Floyd might lead to increased African American turnout, and whether or not that has an impact on the race. And then separately, the impact of, we've suggested that foreign policy isn't really going to have a huge bearing, but what about the influence of bad actors on the foreign stage? Where is this going to be another election where there was a hidden rhythm that we didn't see? We're watching out for it this time, perhaps, but is it going to be a key factor? Why don't you take one of those each?
I'll do the macro turnout. Prior to 6 months ago, I thought we were headed to maybe either a record high turnout or a near record high turnout. The records were set in 1940 and 1960 of votes of the voting eligible population. And as you might recall, the 2014 midterm election was the lowest midterm election turnout that we had, lowest since 1942. Then after Trump's elected, the 2016 turnout was basically normal. It was basically the same. 2016, 2012, 2008, 2004 were all pretty fairly consistent. But then 2018, after Trump was elected, we had the highest voter turnout of any midterm election since 1914. And the interest level pre-coronavirus was higher than it was in some polls throughout the campaigns, you know, past presidentials and other up until the last 2 or 3 weeks. And this was in the odd numbered year. So we were looking at extraordinary turnout levels. Then obviously the coronavirus hits and people are somewhat preoccupied with something else, and those interest levels started coming down. Then I think it started bottoming out, started kind of coming back up. I think there are going to be issues, certainly in some states that have never done much in terms of vote by mail. I think we're going to have a very, very strong turnout. I think we are. I think a lot of people would be voting in ways they've never voted before, but I think we're going to have a very, very strong turnout. I think the African-American vote was already going to turn out at real high levels. Right. So would George Floyd elevate it some? Yes, but the thing is, you can only vote once. And if for people that were already motivated, and the thing is, African Americans as a general, they really, really, really didn't like Donald Trump before George Floyd. Mm-hmm. So it will boost it some, but we're talking about a fairly narrow band. I mean, the two times that Obama was on the national ballot, 13% of the electorate was African American, 13. Okay, it did go down with Hillary Clinton. It went from 13 to 12. Right. It had been 11 under John Kerry and 10 under Al Gore. So it went up, but it didn't go up that much. That much. But but you have all kinds of other moving parts of turnouts that weren't good.
Sabrina, tell me what's the Journal been reporting in terms of foreign influence on the election, and is there any what's the state of play with anxiety about the Facebook factor, if I can call it that?
Well, there is a great deal of anxiety about foreign influence in 2020. One is simply what we saw in 2016, which is continuing evidence that the Russians are trying once again, or not even trying, but they're actively interfering in the political process, using similar means to try and sow discord within the American public. Robert Mueller, when he was testifying on the special counsel investigation on Capitol Hill, which now seems like a lifetime ago, said they're doing it right now. They're doing it while we sit right here. So now I think there's also a question of other governments, such as China and Iran, who, according to U.S. intelligence officials, are also trying to interfere in the election, and that is consistent with the reporting we've done at the Wall Street Journal. This president, as we know, has repeatedly declined to take more concrete steps to deter foreign interference in the elections, despite there being legislation that has been proposed in Congress to do so. Again, based on the conclusion of that same Mueller report, the Russians acted in 2016 with the intent of helping then candidate Trump's campaign. So it's not necessarily a real question mark as to why he has declined to really address these issues. I think with respect to Facebook, this has been an ongoing debate, and it's reaching more and more of a fever pitch where people want these tech companies to self-regulate with a greater degree to which they have in the past, because some of these foreign actors are using social media as a key tool in those efforts to kind of infiltrate public perception and sharing fake false information, a kind of disinformation campaign that has been at the core of some of those efforts has been through Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other tech companies. And Facebook in particular, Mark Zuckerberg, has really dug his heels into this argument that we are not the arbiters of truth. It is not our job to regulate political speech. And that has been a big source of frustration for civil rights advocates, for Democrats, and a lot of people who believe that Facebook in particular really played a significant role in the success that the Russians saw in 2016 in their foreign interference efforts. But they haven't changed it. I mean, they haven't. I think
they haven't changed anything, have they?
They haven't changed anything.
I'm just gonna. We're rapidly running out of time. Can I just throw? I've made you two work very hard for your money before breakfast, haven't I? And
there's money?
There's money. There's probably not money, is there? Oh my God, I'm on the record now. So one more question for you both. If you ever get out of the house before November the 3rd, where would you most want to go to report on this election?
So what's the tipping point state? Is that what you're driving at?
Just where you just think that to me is a great story and I want to be there.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
I want to go to Georgia because I think it is a very interesting state, particularly with respect to access to the ballot. There have been a great deal of concerns around voter suppression, and a state that Democrats have been targeting for a long time that has typically been in the column of Republicans, and really in some ways has become a microcosm for the effects of gerrymandering and voter ID laws that have barred non-white voters, particularly Black voters, from being able to access the ballot. And so I think it's just a fascinating story. And in many ways, like I said, a microcosm of bigger issues at a national level.
Absolutely right. Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for taking part today. I'm just going to very briefly just land on 2 or 3 things that we discussed. So I think what we've learned is we don't know what's going to happen. But we think we're talking about 6 states that we need to watch: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania of last time, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina in the mix this time. Again, if I'm keeping up here, Charlie flagged non-college educated white women and college educated white men as being two very significant demographics. Turnout, we talked about, African American turnout is probably already going to be very high, so it may not be something that moves the needle. What are the issues? Well, certainly not foreign policy, we think. Definitely the economy, and that's gone weaker for Trump. Competence and integrity seem to be the things that Biden's trying to really push, and Trump again will, it would seem, not be trying to extend the reach. He's simply trying to get out the people he got out last time and more of them, and division seems to be his friend when it comes to being a campaigner. I'm just reminded again of something somebody said to me once in DC, and they were talking about, it was when the Iran nuclear deal was really hot as an issue, and they said, well, the thing is, on this subject, there are two phrases you need to remember in order to be an expert, and they are, I don't know, and it depends. And I think you can use them both liberally in the next phase, because let's face it, none of us has a very good crystal ball, and I think there's miles to go before November the 3rd. I hope you two might join us again before then, because it's been so invigorating to hear from you.
Would love to.
And I'm giving you a solid 9 each for Rate My Room. And we haven't even talked about those high tops on the top of your bookshelf, Sabrina.
Those definitely belong to my husband, if there was any doubt.
Excellent work. Well, listen, thanks again. I think we're going slightly over the time, so I'm going to call it. Enjoy your breakfast if you haven't had it already in DC, and give my regards to the Washington Nationals, won't you?
Yes.
Will do.
World champions. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.